Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fairly Unbalanced. This is actually a quick response to a viewer's question. Yesterday, I did a video on what I think the right wing means when they use the term woke or wokeism, and my argument is that it's basically what their grandpappies used to call uppity. Uh, for those of us who are woke or who strive to be woke, it is a recognition of systemic injustices and a desire to correct them. From the Ron DeSantis's of the world, woke is a pejorative term that, yeah, again, uh, it's what their grandfathers would have called Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, an uppity. Only now it's uppity queers and uppity trans folks to those guys on the right. So a viewer offered a challenge and said, could you cite the laws in the United States that are systemically unfair or systemically unjust? And to answer that question, I actually want to take a step back into history, mytho-history, and then move up to actuality. The mytho-history goes back to Odysseus, Ulysses in the Odyssey or the Iliad. I can't remember which one. There's a scene in the book, the Homer's book, where Odysseus knows that his ship is going to be sailing by some rocks where the sirens live. And so he orders his sailors to bind him to the mast. He wants to hear the sirens sing because they have beautiful voices, but as a sailor, he understands that when the sirens sing, sailors are drawn to their voices and then they shipwreck and everybody dies. And so he gives a fundamental order. He says, whatever I shout after you bind me to the mast, do not let me go. This is your fundamental order. Tie me to the mast until we are well away from these sirens. And the sailors do it. They tie him to the mast. He listens to the sailors, and he aches to go to those rocks. But since he's bound to the mast, he can't steer the ship towards them, and the ship sails on to safety. This metaphor is often used in political theory to describe the notion of a constitutional government. It is a fundamental law that recognizes that the human beings involved in the governmental system are not perfect, and there may be a desire and a push to take away certain rights from individuals. And this is a law that says no matter what happens, you can't do that. And it's an important but not a foolproof, is an important but not a foolproof prevention or preventative measure to protect the rights of individuals. Now let's go to a little bit of history, and we will get to the gentleman's question about the laws. But first, I want to go back to just post-Reconstruction United States. 1877, federal troops are pulled out of the American South. The 15th Amendment, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have all been passed. The 15th Amendment specifically says that the states and the federal government shall pass no law that will restrict the franchise, the vote, for men based upon their race or their former condition of servitude. It is a very specific law that says no matter what, you cannot take away someone's right to vote based upon the color of their skin or if they were a slave before. The intention of this is very clear, and it is to make sure that we don't have a system of injustice that we've just fought a war to end. But you know what happens? In 1877, with the removal of the federal troops and the beginning of Jim Crow, states across the South start to pass laws that specifically are written to be race neutral. Nowhere in a grandfather clause that prevents someone from voting if their grandfather was a slave do you violate the principle that you are taking away a man's right to vote based upon his skin color or his former condition of servitude. You're not. You're taking it away based upon his grandfather's former condition of servitude. It's a way to get around the law. A literacy test. Nowhere in a literacy test in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi in 1890 is there anything about race. But the way the laws are implemented is very clearly, it manifests racism. The guy who gives the test, who gives the literacy test, only gives the hard test to the black guys who come in. And so, after the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of Jim Crow, we have laws that say that you cannot be specifically racist in terms of the vote, and yet it still exists. So that's one answer to this guy's question. Can I point to specific laws that create a system of injustice in the United States today? Off the top of my head, no, I can't, at least when it comes to race. We aren't apartheid South Africa. We don't have code books. We don't have internal documentation that prevents people from moving. But you know what? We do have a judicial system where, per capita, 5 times more African Americans are incarcerated than white people. Why is that? Is there a law anywhere that says we need to incarcerate more black people? No. In fact, there are laws that say we can't do that. And yet, systemically, the bias exists at almost every level of the criminal justice system, from officer bias against African Americans to socioeconomic conditions that remove the ability of people who are arrested for petty crime to be able to afford a lawyer, and therefore they end up in Rikers, can't pay bail, and a public defender comes to them and says, "Look, I can get you 2 years, but you're facing 10, so you may as well take the deal." That happens a lot more in African American communities than it does in white communities, and so we end up with this 5 times greater incarceration rate, which is clearly systemic, even though there's no law. And so that's one part of the answer is, yes, clearly we do have systemic injustice, even if there are no specific laws that enforce it. It's the system. It's systemic. But then let's bring this right up to the present. And to go to what the subject of the original video was, which is largely centering around LGBT rights and trans rights. In Florida, Ron DeSantis and the incredibly gerrymandered Florida legislature last year passed the Don't Say Gay bill. Now, that's what people on my side of the political fence call it. Ron DeSantis gets upset about that. But part of that provision of that bill is that you're not supposed to have a conversation about gender or sexuality in a elementary school classroom, which on the surface seems like it might be a sensible law. But let me ask you this. If I'm a 6th grade teacher in Florida, do you think it's okay with Ron DeSantis if I mention that George Washington had a wife named Martha? If I'm married to a woman and I'm a teacher in Florida, is it okay that I mention my wife? I would imagine you'd say, yeah, it's fine if you do both of those things. But now, is it acceptable if I mention that Pete Buttigieg, our Secretary of Transportation, has a husband named Chasen? Is it okay if I am a gay man and I have a husband and I mention him to my students? Now, the law doesn't specifically address this, but the law is very clearly written to allow one of those things, the discussion of normal heterosexual relationships, while forbidding the discussion of homosexual relationships. And that is a systemic injustice. And that's what us woke, uppity people feel that we should be doing battle against. So, just a couple of minutes on that. It's a lovely day here in Binghamton, New York. Please keep the questions coming. I'll do my best to answer them. And love to you all, unless you are a fascist.